Apologies in advance for potentially causing you to need to re-roll Iron Lung. Now, this is actually something that I've been saying for God knows how long, and hopefully, if people are feeling lovely, it's going to be the first time I actually really, well, not the first time, but the fourth time I actually asked for this. If we could get some likes, some comments, some shares, just to spread this, just because this is kind of something that actually pains me, and that is simply, on an LMG, with the third attribute, what is the best role? And I'm generally always quite surprised. I mean, it kind of stands to reason, since we're basically told from the get-go that things like damage to targets out of cover, damage to armor, blah 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 blah, these are multipliers, they help. Don't get me wrong, this is correct. However, with LMGs it's weird because they come with a huge boost to damage to targets out of cover of 12%. However, with a lot of them, depending on the build, attachment wise, they struggle in other areas. Now, if you're wanting probably the most balanced setup for an LMG, simply because they come, or you can put on, a very powerful set of gloves, you might have heard of them, Contractors, which come with LMG damage as well as damage to armor. LMGs also come with damage to targets out of cover on them natively, so if you wanted the most balanced setup, damage to health is actually probably the best in slot here. However, this does actually then mean that we're kind of sacrificing an entire attribute for what is potentially going to be 2% of the game. Trungers, Warhounds, the occasional shield dude, if you hit a helmet on a True Sons guy, that's basically it. So it's technically like the better option, but it's also incredibly inefficient, which then leaves us with what a lot of people would argue to be damage to armor to be the best in slot role. No. Yeah, so I'm sorry to tell you, if you've put damage to armor on your Iron Lung, then, I mean, if you want to go, if it doesn't bother you, obviously, fine. It's not like it's going to be that huge of a difference, but if you are one of these, like me, best in slot, meta. Apparently, I'm elitist. I just like DPS, I'm sorry. But yeah, if you want to go down the maximum DPS route, depending on your build and how accurate you are, you have two options. Rate of fire and crit chance. Hopefully making myself all big highlights just how serious I actually am. Now, I tested a variety of builds. The two that basically came up on top is this one, which is 4-piece strikers, a chest-to-chest with obliterate, and Coyote's mask. I tested it with damage to armor, rate of fire, and crit chance. I did also do damage to health just because meh, but because I wanted to, really, but it works, and it does exceptionally well against Chungers, Warhounds, etc. But again, it's inefficient because you're essentially putting the entire stat into your build that is for potentially like 2% of the game. The next build is essentially the same thing, but rather than Coyote's mask, we're going to use Contractor's gloves. Now, the Contractor's gloves variant of this, 4-piece strikers, chest-to-chest, Contractor's gloves, does end up being better in pretty much most ways, simply just because you're using LMG. You're getting your damage to armor, you're getting your LMG damage, and then you're able to supplement this with other roles or attributes on the weapon itself, such as rate of fire, crit chance. You could go more damage to armor, but it's mostly not really worth it, simply just because Contractors will give you 8%, whereas the roll on an LMG gives you 6%. So no, not worth it. And of course, in true me fashion, there are spreadsheets to back this up. Now, annoyingly, the reason I previously said this is going to be dependent a lot on your accuracy is because where you then have higher multiplier or a higher chance to get a higher multiplier, crit chance and damage to armor, the bullet damage is potentially going to be higher, as well as when you get headshots, you are going to get a little bit more because larger multipliers multiplying together will give you more shock, horror, gasp. However, what we really care about is going to be like your overall average DPS, and there's not really a lot in this. Like, it's less than a bullet. So like one of them ends up being like 13.2, million DPS. The other one's like 13 DPS, 13 million, and the other one's like 12.9 million DPS. There's like a total of 300k difference between the three. DTA at the bottom, shock or a gasp. Crit chance in the middle, and rate of fire at the top. However, technically speaking, rate of fire is the best in-slot attribute for LMGs, basically all of the time. There's like one area where it isn't, and that is very, very niche and not helpful, simply just because it's the Aqueducts build for Iron Horse, where I do believe they roll damage to health. That is it. Now, the reason I'm potentially making a bigger deal out of this than it's actually worth is quite simple. If LMGs had a meta, it previously was the L86 and the RPK. The L86 and the RPK basically dominated the LMG space, and it wasn't even by a little bit. Then Iron Lung came along, and Iron Lung does to LMGs what Ouroboros does to SMGs. It's kind of silly how powerful the Iron Lung actually is. The talent is still really bad. The attachments on it are still questionable. It's got 2 critical hit damage mods rather than a crit chance and a crit damage. If it had that crit chance, crit damage mods, it would be infinitely better, but we've got 20% crit damage for some random bizarre reason. I'm sure that's an oversight, but hey ho, here we go. Just for some perspective, the static base DPS of the L86, which was the highest burst DPS LMG, was 607,000. Iron Lung is like 721,000. So it's like another 100k, over 100k over the L86. So Iron Lung is now just completely dominating the LMG space. Obviously, there is still the problem of it being an LMG. Slow reload, blah blah blah. So, up first to hit the spreadsheets is going to be the build with Contractor's gloves. As you can see, we've got rate of fire, critical hit chance, and then damage to armor. This is their DPS. I'm going to use rate of fire as the bench line. Thank you, Rousey, for showing me this. And hopefully we can see that with critical hit chance, the damage is basically the same. The only difference now is going to be the increased rate of critical hit chance, but we have dropped 40 RPM. So, where rate of fire is now the baseline, sorry, I'm still trying to get used to this new way of showing it. On headshot, critical hit chance is going to do 0.9% more, whereas on body shot, we are only going to be doing 96.18% damage of the rate of fire. We then come to damage to armor. As you can see, the numbers are higher. However, we've got the critical hit chance of the rate of fire, but we're losing quite a bit in RPM, surprisingly. Our headshots in terms of DPS, this is literally saying that we are going to be hitting 100% accuracy on headshots, but this will be 1.16% more DPS. However, this is not feasible. However, on body shots, we're actually doing less than the critical hit chance. We're only going to be doing 94.61% of the rate of fire. So both of these builds, their percentages are compared to the top one, the rate of fire. So hopefully, as you can see, rate of fire is technically the better. Now the right hand side where it says average, this is assuming you get 60% body shots, 40% headshots. Again, this is unfeasible, but this will be like their average DPS roughly, depending on how you want to look at it. However, if you get exclusively headshots, crit chance will do 0.9% more. If you get exclusively headshots with DTA, you'll do like just over 1% more. However, on an LMG, like I said, this isn't feasible. You'll mostly be getting body shots, which means you're going to drop 4% roughly with critical hit chance, and then you're going to be dropping 6%, which is actually quite a difference in DPS with damage to armor. Next up on the chopping block is the build with Coyote's mask. Hopefully we can understand that this is going to be weaker, simply because a lot of the damage is purely coming from the crit. So already we should be able to see this is a little bit weaker. But again, rate of fire is still kind of holding true. The gap is a little bit closer, just simply because in this instance, with Contractors giving both LMG damage and damage to armor, it's so much more powerful on an LMG specifically than Coyotes. So We have dropped a little bit of damage on all 3 of these builds, but it's just a different variation, so hopefully we can see this. Now, in terms of rate of fire, again, this is the bench line. When it comes to critical hit chance, we are doing near enough 1% more on headshot, and we've dropped just 3% now on body. And then with DTA, we're doing 1.58 more on headshot, but we've dropped 3.5, roughly, on body. Now, the overall difference in DPS is mostly going to be negligible. You're not really going to notice this over the course of a mission, unless you're using contractors. Contractors, there will be a very clear difference. Which comes down to my final point. If the mods, the attachments on the Iron Lung do turn out to be an oversight and they do get fixed and it ends up being crit chance and then crit damage rather than crit damage, this will mostly negate the argument for a critical hit chance roll, simply because you're going to be getting that 10% from the mod, so you won't have to put it on as an attribute. See, the downside essentially is we'll mostly look at the one with contractors. This is at 50% crit chance. If we roll critical hit chance onto the weapon, we end up with 59.5. It's quite strange because crit chance on LMG is a 9.5 roll, which is interesting. However, if we do get this change in the attachment, it will end up being 60 with rate of fire, which will absolutely then decimate the potential for damage to armor even being a feasible attribute on Iron Lung. So it really kind of is in the hand of the devs. At the moment, it's not really much in it. However, if they do change the attribute, there will be quite a bit in it. Now, the real added benefit to actually having rate of fire over a damage to armor is kind of the same reason as to why I mentioned damage to health in this as well. See, annoyingly, chungers and warhounds do exist. Your damage to armor does not apply to these. Rate of fire obviously does. So does damage to health. However, putting damage to health on, basically, like I said, you're putting an entire attribute on for what is essentially 2% of the game. Rate of fire is going to be active against everything all of the time. So not only is it going to potentially be doing more in terms of overall DPS, it's also going to be more beneficial to you towards the enemies that LMGs actively struggle against, which are chungers, warhounds, etc, etc. So yeah, have fun, good luck, don't die. Bad for the health.